And let's begin with prayer. Lord, thanks again for the opportunity to learn from your word and help us, Lord, to apply it directly to life that we might honor you with the study. Thank you again for the Ecclesiastes, for Solomon, and for what we can learn from it. And we're grateful again for yourself, your Son, your Spirit, and your Scriptures. Amen. So this was one of those weeks where movies were obviously connected to what we're going to be talking about, which is about justice. So I have to tell you that I'm a big justice movie fan. Sometimes, however, the justice moves into revenge, and so I always have to be wary of that. Yeah, I hear some of that. You know, I wanted to make sure to tie this back into what we talked about last week, which was the issue of time, where we talked about the first 15 verses in chapter 3. So I put up Time Cop, which is, you know, kind of a fun throwback to sci-fi stuff. And of course, you know, Jean-Claude Van Damme can still do splits. It's just amazing to me. Steven Seagal doesn't look like that in the picture any longer, but I can tell some of you are, you know, keep up with this. All right. So Out for Justice, of course, both of these films and so many more like them are about the issues of justice. The problem, of course, is that the justice doesn't come always at the time that we would like it to come. And so I'm impressed then by this connection in verse 16 in chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes, where he's just finishing talking about the issue of time, and then he says, moreover, on top of that, he says, on top of the time, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness even there was wickedness. So he sees this connection between time and the new thing that he's about to unfold, which is the issue of justice. So the problem with time and justice is that we want it now. I'm going to be honest with you and tell you why I like justice films. Because I don't see enough of it in this life. And the reason why I watch them is because I like to see the bad guys get it. Now, if some of you are honest, you are going to say the same thing, more probably under your breath, but I'll stand there as the standard bearer for you all. We do want it now, and that's no kidding, all of us do. Justice issues seek immediate recognition and recompense. People are upset, and you can list any number of justice issues. Feel free. They are upset and they want immediate justice. It's not something they're going to wait for. They want it right now. Everybody wants it. And why is it that everybody wants this? Because we are all bearing God's image. So when people say to me, you know, hey, Mark, how come you get so upset about these things? Or why is it that you watch these kinds of films and talk about these kinds of things? Because I bear God's image, and therefore I am just as interested in justice as God is, because I'm made in his image. So even though my justice is messed up because I move into the revenge category from time to time, nonetheless, it's still there. It's still present within me. And it is, by the way, in you too. One of the words that's used here for justice, in fact, it's the first one, is the Hebrew word mishpat. And it means applied execution of justice. So how are we going to actually put it into practice? So I want to suggest a film to you for those who might enjoy these kinds of films. Gone Baby Gone is a movie that I used to show to full-length feature film to classes because of its ethical implications. So I'll never forget the very first time I watched this movie. I got done with a movie, and it's just way too good a spoiler to put it out there, so I'm just going to keep it. If you ever watch it, I'm not going to spoil it for you. But I was absolutely shocked in myself in the way that I decided the movie should turn out. I was shocked. I didn't think the movie should turn out the way that it turned out. And I was shocked with myself because I should have been on the other side of the issue, but I wasn't. So, the issue of how do you apply justice? And remember what it says in verse 16. You get violent wickedness even with this justice. Let me repeat this again. This is a very important verse. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of mishpat, justice, even there is wickedness. So in the applied execution of justice, we don't always get what we think the wrongdoer deserves. We know that it's wrong. And we see that it's wrong. We feel it's wrong. And then people are still upset because, of course, they don't see the issue of mishpat, execution of justice, being carried through. And to them, and to all of us, we view that as wickedness. But it doesn't stop there. The next word that's used here is really important. You want Zedek? This is the word for righteousness in Scripture. So in Hebrew, so Zedek means something that's straight. The Hebrew ideal for behavioral righteousness, this is what God has. He has Zedek. He wants us to have Zedek. He wants us to have an ideal standard for justice. But guess what? The verse goes on and says exactly the same thing as it did for applied justice. It's not always going to be the way that you think it's going to be, and it turns out to be wickedness. Now, I put this picture up here. This is Bryan Cranston, for those of you who are interested in actors here. But there was a 10-part short limited series, I forget on which platform it's on, but it's entitled Your Honor. Here is a man who is a judge, who does really good work in his community, does really fine judicial carry-through in his community. People love him. They think that he is the standard bearer for justice. He can do no wrong until he does. And that is the whole point of this. He holds up the ideal, but he himself cannot even keep it when push comes to shove. So these kinds of stories are stories that exactly mirror what the Hebrew is telling us here in Ecclesiastes. I want to make sure to say this up front. Do not think that your justice is more important than somebody else's mishpat, somebody else's application of justice, whether it be political, cultural, or judicial. And do not think that your desire for Zedek will cure all ills. Do you catch what I'm trying to emphasize here? We all think, this is wrong. We see this taking place in Washington, D.C. We see this taking place around the world. We see this particular ethnic issue. We see this particular refugee issue, whatever the case. And we think that our thing is the most important thing. But I'm here to tell you that you should think about that for all justice issues, not just yours and not just mine. So don't think that your desire for Zedek will cure all ills. I really love that word. I think righteousness, I'm an idealist. My definition of being an idealist is somebody who's been hammered blows by the hammered blows of life. I become a realist in that sense of things. So we want this, but we're not always going to see it. That is the point of Ecclesiastes. So, at the same time, not hearing about or not speaking against injustice is itself unjust. So when we don't speak out about it, that too is injustice. So hiding injustices is what Johnny Cash called, you may throw your rock and hide your hand, working in the dark against your fellow man, sooner or later God will cut you down. So I put this film up here, True Grit, the newer version of that. Very powerful film. But if you went on the website, I remember when it came out in 2011, whenever it was, and when you popped open the website for True Grit, that song played. God's going to cut you down. And that, by the way, is not a bad thing to keep in mind, because I think the power of it is exactly what Solomon is getting to in this passage. So, not hearing about, not speaking against injustice is itself unjust. And here again, I really am concerned about journalism just generally as a topic, because what I find is that journalists are not always doing their work properly. We get a good example of this in the film Mr. Jones, where we find back in the 1930s in Ukraine, the Ukrainians were being starved to death by Joseph Stalin. He was basically doing ethnic cleansing, and there was only one journalist who would tell the truth. Only one. All the rest of them, Stalin made sure they had really comfortable lives and they could do whatever they wanted to, all kinds of pleasures, all of the rest of that. Only one person stood out and said, this is what's going on. By the way, the New York Times, who originally ran stories that basically covered over Stalin's problems and awfulness, has never given back that Pulitzer Prize. Just thought I'd mention that. So, I believe in the application of universal principles to individual problems. Amos says, seek good and not evil, hate evil and love good. So, tomorrow night, for instance, the anti-human trafficking group is meeting on campus at IUPUI. I'm their advisor. I want to emphasize what is good and hate what is evil. That's our job. So we pick something. We can't be involved in everything, but we pick something. And then ultimately, we also want to participate and partner with what is good that's going on in culture. So we want to do what Jeremiah 29 says. But at the same time, I also believe that these principles are undercut by human corruption. So, does human sinfulness fit into the issue of justice? Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think I mentioned this actually maybe a week or two ago. Mao Zedong, in his little red book, his great statement, "The political power comes out of the barrel of a gun." This is what all dictators do. They subjugate their people, and they kill the ones that won't go along. And I also want to suggest this. We live in a great nation. This is the Declaration of Independence, our first document. But there are no guarantees for this nation. And there are no guarantees, actually, that these ideals will be fleshed out. Remember, we're talking about an ideal here. We're talking about an idea, an ideal. So when people say, what's your political position? I always tell them, I'm a perennial preservationist. I like to tell them different words so that I can tell them what I really think about those words, and not so that they can't just label me in one category or another. But my concern is that I want to preserve the great ideas and ideals that have been given, but there is a problem with absolute truth, and that is that we live in a fallen world. We're not always going to get everything that we think we should get or see, and that again is the point of Ecclesiastes. So Jesus' comment, in this world you will have tribulation. Absolutely true. This is what this passage is about. So, once again, tying it back to last week, if God is sovereign, sovereignty, God has everything under control. We talked about the differences between the top and the bottom of the tapestry. God gets to see what he's actually creating. All the ties and tie-offs and knots are on the underside of the tapestry. But this particular idea gives us this suggestion that time is under God's control, which includes then, of course, justice being under his control. So, back to the tyrants. If you're not familiar with any of these, this is Mao, this is Joseph Stalin, this is Fidel Castro. Human authority without transcendent ethics will turn into a power grab. So I work with a lot of great people at the university who are absolutely thinking different thoughts than I am about this kind of idea. And their great desire and their great hope is that humanity will sometime in the future come to the place where they can gain this great ethical understanding. And I just keep pointing back to history, like the whole 20th century. So, you know, my atheist agnostic friends, if we ever have these kinds of conversations, I just say, look, the 20th century is yours. 100 million people died under atheistic regimes. So let's not forget history. And that's really important. And his point in Ecclesiastes is exactly this. So your ideal, it cannot come from humanity. So human authority without transcendent ethics turns into a power grab. And here we get to the issue of justice. And all of these notes, again, are on your pages here. But I want to emphasize this idea that justice is impossible for us. Atheistic humanism resulting from a belief that we live in a world of chance, the strong survive. So all of these people, all these dictators I'm showing you, were all evolutionists. They all believed that might makes right, that the strong survive, that the weak will die. So, you know, you've got, of course, Adolf, and then you've got Pol Pot and Idi Amin. So all of these people, doesn't matter where the country is, doesn't matter the culture, once you believe that humanity has the responsibility for justice alone, that we make the rules, oh man, we are in deep stuff right there. It's really important to understand that. So a note here about apologetics. Apologetics is a word that simply means defending the faith. So when I talk about apologetics, basically what I'm doing in this kind of slide is doing cultural apologetics. I'm showing you what culture says, and I'm showing you how to defend the faith against the culture and what it says. So in this case, I'm saying to us, what does Scripture teach? Scripture teaches justice is impossible if it's left up to just us. Justice is impossible if it's left up to just us. So that is the first point that we want to make sure to make, and this is exactly what Solomon is suggesting here to us in this passage. And here's a few more. This is Assad, Bashar al-Assad. This is Xi from China, and this is Khamenei from Iran. Here is the first objection that people will throw out to us. If there is a God, why is there so much injustice in the world? So what they suggest is, of course, that there's all kinds of abusive people and abuse of power and all of these kinds of things, and this goes against our morality. Well, what does Ecclesiastes say? Let's take a look. Again, verse 16 I've already read. Let's drop down to 4:1 because this is kind of a repeat of some of the ideas here. He says, "Again I saw all the oppressions that were done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them." So this is what people will say to us. They'll say, all this injustice in the world, what are you going to do about this? And my response is going to begin by saying, well, let's look at it from your perspective and see how this is going to turn out. How has history shown us that these kinds of people are actually going to do the right and good thing? So I'm going to be watching NFL football this afternoon. I don't know what you're going to be doing, but that's where I'm going to be. And we see all kinds of things in the NFL. We see the back of helmets saying stop hate, end racism. And these are all wonderful ideals. But I want to emphasize they are ideals. They are not necessarily going to take place on this earth during our lifetime or any human lifetime. My response is always the same. Yeah, this is going to end when Jesus comes. But it's not going to end ultimately until he comes. So the oppressors and the oppressed, we are the beasts. Check this out, verse 18. This is a head-shaking statement here from Solomon. In 3:18, he said, "I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts." Whoa. You mean you are calling me a wild animal? Yep. And by the way, not me, but Solomon. So, take it up with him. It's like I say to my friends who don't believe in eternal judgment, Jesus said it more than anybody else. So, talk to him about this. Anyway, so to the handout. I wanted to point out to you that while the outline is here on the front, I've also given you a lot of extra notes this week, which I kind of took from my own notes back when I was teaching on wisdom in 2016. And I wanted you to notice things like the problem with social justice. I'll just give it to you in a nutshell. There are two questions whenever anybody brings up social justice. What is your social? And what is your basis for justice? So everybody's got a social justice thing they want to have. Okay, well, let's talk about what that social is, because that's motivating your justice. And then the issue of justice. What's your basis for it? How can you say something is unjust? Tell me about that. And most people can't. They cannot give you an answer to those kinds of questions. So I wanted to make sure that you had a whole bunch of stuff here. There's all kinds of statements here from Proverbs about justice, what we should stand against, principles that I think would serve us well as Christians. And then, of course, these principles from Isaiah 58 and 59, which, to me is the centerpiece of God's teaching in First Testament about justice and our responsibility to it, and the implications from his point of view, and then, of course, for his people. So this is a story that is a powerful story. It comes out of the time when Mike Wallace was doing 60 Minutes. This is a story that tells us about Yehiel Denur, who sees Adolf Eichmann for the very first time when Eichmann is brought up on charges, his extermination camps and all of the awfulness he did during the Nazi regime. And he broke down when he was in the courtroom. And Mike Wallace was interviewing him after the fact, and Mike Wallace said, was it because you were in the presence of this murderer? Was it you were thinking about all of these awfulnesses of the past? And Yehiel Denur said, no, I could be like Eichmann. That's why I was sobbing. I could be just like him. So I'm just going to take a moment here to say this again. Every single person sitting in this room, every single person around the world can be an Adolf Eichmann, can be a Joseph Stalin, can be an Idi Amin. Every single one of us. When I was teaching Gothic Horror Lit, we would get to the end of those great books that we would teach, and I would ask them what was their emotive response to the books. And every single time, the students would say, when reading books about monsters, I realized I was the monster. Every single time. Those stories are purely morality tales, and they're very important. The importance of horror and the importance of science fiction shows us for what we are. So, this is, again, Bryan Cranston when he was doing Breaking Bad. And this was something that I wrote back in 2013. You can go find it on one of my websites, Warp and Woof. And it's just titled Bad. And I remember watching this, going binge watching this thing, catching up with it on the summer and during the summertime when we weren't teaching. And every single time, Bryan Cranston continued to devolve into the worse and worse and worse person. And I felt like I was on the screen doing the murders. That's how this program made me feel. I was looking at myself in the mirror. So you'll notice at the top of the page here where I've put justice is impossible if left up to just us, right underneath that I've written the worst abusers of justice look back at us from the mirror. None of us should think that we are over this. None of us. So these kinds of ideas, for me, I saw myself in Bryan Cranston's character. These kinds of things kind of bring us up short and remind us again of the power of what injustice is doing for us. So, here's the second objection. If there's an afterlife, why isn't there proof of this afterlife? Why do I bring up afterlife when we're talking about justice? Well, here's the reason why. The issue is that everybody dies. Well, you're going to say, well, Mark, it's pretty obvious, right? Well, let's see what Solomon has to say about this. Let's read 3:18 through 4:3. So we just read 18, that they might see themselves are but beasts. Verse 19, for what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same thing. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts. For all is vanity. All go to this one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward or the spirit of the beast goes down to the earth? So I saw that there's nothing better than a man should do than rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be done after him? Again I saw the oppression that was done under the sun. Behold, the tears of the oppressed. They had no one to comfort them. On the side of the oppressors there was power. There was no one to comfort them. And I thought, the dead who are already dead are more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. So, what good is it talking about justice if everybody dies and we don't really see true justice in this life? I think that the answer to this is very important. And the reason, my answer is always going to be Psalm 73. So Psalm 73, Asaph is a priest. He writes this psalm. And in the first 10 verses, he talks about how the wicked prosper. The wine, women, and song kind of comment. Here is this guy. He's got everything. And nothing ever bad happens to him. And I'm looking at him going, I'm doing all of this, and I'm a righteous man of God. I'm a priest before God in the temple. And he goes through this long lament. And then he gets to verses 15 to 17, and he says, it wasn't until I understood their final destiny. His point, life is short, eternity is long. Life is short, eternity is long. And my point is, if there is no justice in the afterlife, there can be no justice in this life. If there is not a life after this life, then why in the world should I pursue justice? Rape, pillage, and burn. Watch the cities burn. Why should I care about such things if I actually don't believe there's an afterlife? But if there is, and I'm responsible to that one who controls that afterlife, that changes everything. So now I understand the first question, the objection about injustice. Now I get to see, there's an eternity that I'm responsible for. And I'm responsible to the one who jurisdicts that in eternity. So these are important concepts, and the reason why I bring them up, because they answer the questions that everybody's asking. So, justice is possible for God. I've just read this verse, but I'll read it again. Again, the power of it is very important for us, and it tells us the answer to the question that we all want. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work, including eternal justice. So he's bringing that time concept back again. He's saying there's time for everything, including eternal justice, that God will do it someday. So there will come a time when everything will be taken care of, that he will take care of all things. And this reminds us again of our diagram from Ecclesiastes, that you either have an under-the-sun view, which means that you're looking for justice, you want justice, you march for justice, you carry your signs for justice, but you don't get to see it. If you believe in a God who has given all of life as a gift, you understand that not only do we bear that responsibility in this life, but in the next as well. So, righteousness, justice, and peace in that order. If I was doing this on a whiteboard, I would put 3 blocks, one on top of the other. The first one would be righteousness. The second would be justice. The third would be peace. So back to my question that I ask people, when you tell me that you want justice, I'm going to ask you, what's your basis for justice? Now, my basis for justice, being a very Christian thinker, is that there has to be a straight standard for it. That's what righteousness means. Zedek, again. Righteousness is the standard. Even though I may not see it in this world, I will see God take care of the whole thing in the next life. That gives us justice, which ultimately then gives us peace. And guess where I got that from? Romans 5:12-17. Because Jesus is the one who satisfies the Father's justice through the righteous standard that he kept, and then, of course, he gives us peace because of it. So what is your basis for justice? It's going to be based on righteousness every single time. Now, you might say to me, well, I don't like your book, the Bible. I don't like your ethical pronouncements. The church has done X, Y, Z in the past, and that obliterates any kind of goodness. That's junk. All of that kind of thinking moves past the responsibility that you bear to think about these ideas without giving me excuses like those. So justice is coming. Isaiah 9, for to us a child is born, a son is given. The government shall be upon his shoulder. His name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. He will rule with justice and righteousness. And there it is, those 2 words coming together, from this day forward. That's what we anticipate. This is the hope that we have. So, when I think about this, where are we going? If God is sovereign, let me reread this verse again, verse 22. This kind of summarizes where we're at. Ecclesiastes 3:22, so I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? I don't know what's coming after me. I don't bear responsibility for that. I bear responsibility for now, and, of course, to build something for now that somebody else can build upon later on. So, I bear responsibility to understand my own unjust inclinations, and I have them all the time. Instead of expecting fairness, I should be giving fairness to people, and that's really hard to do. Protest for those who cannot protest for themselves. Like I mentioned, the anti-human trafficking group tomorrow. We protest against those who are trafficking, especially young women, but also the pro-life movements that are on campus are very important to us. And then thank God for your freedoms, and then release somebody from oppression. When I think about this, I think about the economic issue. Is there any way that you can help relieve somebody's struggle, let's say, for instance, financially? That might be just one area, but it is nonetheless an issue of justice for us. So if we can do that, and you read Scripture and you see God saying, the poor, take it in the neck every single time, take care of the poor, then here we have this responsibility. So here's Billy Graham. I'm suggesting justice is not judgmental. And Graham said, it is the Spirit's job to convict, it's Jesus' job to judge, and it's my job to love people. It's not my job to point out the problems, of course, with any kind of, you're going to hell kind of concept. I just point this stuff out to people. I'll never forget a conversation I had in an airplane. This guy sitting next to me is from Fort Wayne, and we're going to the West Coast. He's an engineer. And when you get in a plane, you sit next to somebody and, you ask them stuff, and if they want to follow up the conversation, you do, and if they don't, that's fine. I've got a lot of books to read. So, one thing led to another. I asked him what he did. He told me. He asked me what I did. I told him I was a professor. He said, well, what are you a professor of? And I said, well, I'm a professor of theology. Well, that changed the mood right there. Right then and there. And he said, with a scowl on his face, I'm not kidding you, man, that crinkled up that face, with a scowl on his face, what kind of theology? I said, I am a Christian theologian. Well, he was sitting next to me, and I could feel the burn on my shoulder, I got to tell you. And then he said this. He said, are you one of those Christians who believes that if I don't believe what you believe, that I'm going to hell? And I started to laugh. And I said, sir, I am not in the eternal judgment business. And he stopped and he said, I have never heard anybody say that before. And then we carried on a conversation for 2 hours. Because that's not my job. My job is not to tell you you're going to hell. My job is to point you to Jesus, who is going to talk about hell, and you can take that or leave it. That's your job, not my job. My job is to love you, and my loving of that person means to point him to Jesus. And by the way, I get in trouble for this. I got in trouble for this last week on social media, where I emphasized this very point, that if you're going to take some of Jesus' words, like love your neighbor, you can't just drop the stuff that he talks about eternal hellfire. You got to deal with that in some way. And if you want to try and reinterpret it in some kind of poetic fashion, well, you just go ahead and try that. I suspect that when you run into some of those passages, you're going to have some real trouble there. So, the emphasis for the prophets is the same for us. Nothing has changed. God's going to cut you down. Here is this line again from the movie True Grit, through Johnny Cash. I would also suggest to you, in just a couple of minutes remaining, that this was for a long time one of my favorite books, The Holiness of God. Still is. Great book. R.C. Sproul was one of those theologians who could, he could lay it down, and then he could tell you how it applies. And he could tell you a story or two. And there are some cool stories in this book. One of them, I used to read verbatim. I would take out my copy when we were talking about the justice of God, and I would read them the story that comes out of this book. It's a long story, so I won't go into the whole thing, but if you can find it on the pages concerning holy justice. If you have a hard copy, it's page 161. He tells a story about being a professor and about students wanting fairness. And his great question, you want fairness? You really want me to be fair? Then let me show you what real fairness is. So you go read that story. You'll have a good laugh this afternoon. If you, as a good PCA person, you should probably have a copy of every Sproul book in your library. All right. If I haven't been exercised enough about justice and injustice, I don't know what else to say. So we have about 5 minutes for questions, thoughts from you.
Have you ever had what you would feel is a good description of what social justice is from somebody who strongly promotes it or says that they are working hard for social justice issues? Because I have a difficult time nailing people down on what they do. Because in order to have a conversation about it, I need to know what it is they're talking about. And I have a hard time ever getting beyond it.
Yeah. And that's why I go to those two questions. What is the social that you're really interested in, and what's your basis for justice? So good definitions. I think the definitions come out of Scripture, especially for the issue of justice. And my point about the social issue is that we should care about those who are most susceptible to being oppressed. So anybody who's weak, which would include women and children, anybody who is poor, anybody who is oppressed, anybody who's in prison. We could go down the line of all of the passages and statements in places like Isaiah 58 and 59. But that's what I would do. I would ask them, okay, tell me, what is the one social thing that you're really upset about? Just so I know what it is. And then answer the second question about the basis for justice, because that, I think, will begin the starting point. In terms of a good definition from somebody, I think the Scripture does the best job of that. And I'm really interested in listening to people, so I hear them. I hear what they care about. Just for instance, this week in class, I invited one of my African-American brothers to come in, and we were talking about what does it mean to think properly and have a civil conversation and so on. And I wanted it to be a statement to my class, just as it was, a white man and a black man having a conversation. But I will always remember some of the conversations he and I have had where he will say to me, I wish that white evangelicals were as upset about the injustices done to blacks as they are about the pro-life position. And he will quickly add, and I wish that my black brothers and sisters would be as upset about the pro-life issue as they are about racial injustices. This goes both ways. So for us as a church, I think this is a marker for us. It tells us that we need to be caring about whatever the social is for somebody else, even if that's not our first priority. Look, I can't do everything in life. Neither can you. We put ourselves into whatever it is that we do in a justice format, and but at least caring for somebody else's social. That's important. I'm really sorry. I've kind of rambled on you there, but that's what I would just go back to those two questions.
Does the distinction you made between applying justice and a line,
yes,
continue into the New Testament in ways you use the two words that the Hebrew has?
Yes, yeah, there are words that link up in the Second Testament, absolutely, and the application. Just right off the top of my head, the most obvious one to me is James chapter 1. Where the oppressed, the widow and the orphan are to be taken care of, and that is true religion. So the truthfulness, the straightness of religion is that you take care of those who are oppressed or who are in a difficult situation, being treated unjustly in whatever case. He goes on then to magnify that and amplify it in chapter 2, of course, in James chapter 2, which is the whole chapter is about the issue of injustice and treating your brother properly. One more? Please.
You spoke about how knowledge of the afterlife makes all the difference in how people treat one another. We will be held accountable. But do people really do that? Don't people have such a tremendous ability to hide from themselves accountability if it comes a long time later?
Sure. Oh, yeah. I'll read you a verse. Check this out. This is from 1 Timothy chapter 5. You remember what I've been quoting up here? God's going to cut you down. It might take a long time, but he's going to cut you down. Here it is. 1 Timothy 5:24. The sins of some people are conspicuous, going before them to judgment. That is, they get in trouble right away. But the sins of others appear later. So also good works are conspicuous, and even those that are not cannot remain hidden. Justice is going to come one way or the other. It's either going to come right now, or it's going to wait a while, but it's going to come. Thanks, everybody. Oh, don't forget, by the way, we have a break next week, so there is no Sunday school next week. Going along with all the other fall breaks in the school schedule. So I'll see you in 2 weeks.